Hello, welcome to Abolition Radio. My name is Dawn Warfield. I'm a philosophy student at UC Davis, and today I've invited scientific historian Professor Emily Merchant from the Science and Technology Studies Department here at UC Davis to talk about the 2020 census. Hi, Emily.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
So we're coming up on the 2020 census, and it's an election year. And we're in a political climate that is really, where it's very charged how we define being American. Can you briefly clarify the purpose of the U.S. Census and how it relates to the political representation?
Sure. So the census, the United States carries out a census every 10 years that began doing this in 1790. The census is mandated in the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2. And there's actually a really great episode of The West Wing about this. So if you want to know more about the census, I think that's in the first season of The West Wing. But so the purpose of the census is to allocate proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And so our legislative branch is the Congress. It has two houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And in the Senate, votes are equally allocated amongst the states. So every state has two senators. Each senator gets one vote. In the House of Representatives, votes are allocated on the basis of the population of each state. There's 435 voting representatives in the House, and each state has at least one. Beyond that first one, they're allocated on the basis of population. So knowing how many people are in each state is critical for allocating proportional representation in the House of Representatives. And as you'll notice, the representation isn't quite proportionate because very small states, for example, they will have one representative, and that representative will probably represent fewer people than the number of than each representative for, say, California. Historically, the House of Representatives increased in size with each census until 1920. And so as the population of the United States grew, the number of seats in the House of Representatives increased. After 1920, the number of seats was capped at 435. And so as population grows and shifts, the number of people that each representative represents increases, but also as some states gain population and other states lose population, at least proportionately, representatives will shift around among the states. So the number of representatives that a state has can change on the basis of the census. So the census is done every 10 years in order to rebalance the House of Representatives.
Oh, that's great. That tells us a lot.
And I should add also that in electing a president, so that's the executive branch of government, each, as you know, we don't elect the president directly. We vote for members of the Electoral College. And so each state gets the number of votes that's equal to their number of representatives plus their number of senators. And of course, every state has two senators. So beyond the first two Electoral College votes, the number of votes that a state gets is based on their population.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of people were really confused when the popular vote didn't win, because we imagine that the Electoral College is always going to consistently align with that the two, both the popular and the electoral are going to align and kind of balance out. But this time we saw a very marked shift, and that explains a lot about like how the representation of that worked out. So when does the reapportionment actually happen?
So the census data, the data that are released by the Census Bureau for the purpose of reapportionment, will get released by the end of 2020. And
So it won't affect this election?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct. The 2020 census will not affect the 2020 election. The 2020 election will be done on the basis of apportionment and redistricting that was done after the 2010 census. But by the end of the year, the data will be made available. Congressional reapportionment will happen immediately. It'll be decided, which states will gain representatives, which states will lose representatives. It's then up to the legislature of each state to redraw their district boundaries for congressional districts and for statewide voting districts. Not statewide voting districts, but for legislative districts within each state. And the states can do that anytime after the data becomes available.
Okay.
We'll probably see a lot of action on that in 2021.
I would think so. It's pretty heated, and there's been a lot of talk about the districting and how some of these lines are drawn to include or exclude certain populations.
Exactly.
But speaking of excluded populations, a lot of the charged concerns about the census have to do with race and the race questions. Why does the government need to know what race people self-identify as?
Well, so at this point, I like the way that you asked that question, why does the government need to know? At this point, it's basically path dependency, and I'll explain that. So in the very first census, everyone was asked, are you, and the options at the time were Black, white, and American Indian. There were, of course, other people here at the time, but those were the categories that the census used. And, and I think race was always a very politically charged category in the United States, especially during the period of racial slavery, but then, of course, afterwards during the Jim Crow era as well. And so the idea with collecting data about race, and I should say that the census is used for several different purposes. And so it's used for the purpose of governance, so collecting information that's directly necessary to govern the population. So not just in terms of apportioning representatives, but also in terms of designing policies that are relevant for the population of the United States. Census data are also used by social scientists. So social scientists have all kinds of questions that they want to be able to ask. Census data, for a long time, actually was about the only source of data since about the mid-20th century. We've had a lot of other sources of data. And then the third use of census data is for business. So businesses like to know what people are where, so who's where. And so the census has a lot of stakeholders, and over time, different stakeholders had different kinds of investment in the race question. So government certainly, with the rise of race science in the 19th century. So race science, you should definitely be thinking this is scientific racism. So this is the use of science to support racist policies, racially exclusionary policies, including at the time slavery. And so scientists who were doing this kind of work on race also wanted data from the Census Bureau. And then certainly in the post-slavery and Jim Crow eras for state governments that wanted to maintain very overt forms of discrimination, also using this data. After the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the federal government got invested in defending the civil rights of the U.S. population. So the government, the federal government, I should say, got charged with defending civil rights and enforcing civil rights legislation. So since 1964, the data, census data on race have been used for that purpose as well. And so when I say path dependency, that's kind of what I mean. So because data had been collected on the basis of race for such a long time and had been used for such a long time to promote racism, exclusion, slavery, Jim Crow, all of these exclusionary purposes, then in order to then try to reverse some of that discrimination, to try to address it and to promote and defend civil rights, the government, again, needs that same exact data. So now the data can be used for example, if somebody brings a lawsuit claiming employment discrimination on the basis of race, what the government will do is use data from the census to say, okay, how many people in this area are there in each racial category, and how many people are in this particular job, in order to see, like, okay, is there evidence of discrimination there? So so there was a big shift at 1964, when the US government really did then need to know the race that people self-identify as in order to defend civil rights and protect, enforce civil rights legislation. However, the census data are still used for discriminatory purposes, particularly in the drawing of voting districts. And this is something that's been in the Supreme Court recently. So the data that are made available from the census, I should say, like each individual person's self-identification is kept private for 72 years. So after 72 years, individual census returns are archived in the National Archives and they're made publicly available. Before that, the only data that are available for most purposes are aggregate data. So you can see in a certain geographical area, and the census deals with several different geographies. So you can see at the state level, at the county level, all the way down to census block level, how many people there are in each racial category in each level of geography. And this is used to draw voting districts, often in very discriminatory ways. So I don't want to make it sound like, that race classification is only used for good purposes now, because that's not the case. And I should also say, I mentioned that the census has several different stakeholders, and that these different stakeholders have been invested in the census race question in different ways over time. And as a result of that, you actually see the race categories used in the census changing over time. So as I said, initially the only categories were white, black, and Native American. When race scientists started getting interested in the data in the 19th century, they convinced Congress to add another category for mixed race people. And so you just see different categories kind of coming in and out of the census race schema over time. And the categories that we use now, so the census's official race categories now are white, African American, Native American and Alaska Native, Asian, and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. So there's 5 categories, and these 5 categories are they're required by law. They were promulgated by the Office of Management and Budget Statistical Directive 15, which was originally established in 1977. The categories were a little bit different then. They were revised in 1995. But so these are the categories that we have now in the census, not because these are kind of the natural categories into which people fall, but because these categories were established by law as the categories along which people had been discriminated against and which should be used for civil rights enforcement. And so those, but kind of, what's a little bit ironic about that is because the categories have remained the same for such a long time, they start to take on this sense of being natural. Right?
Yeah, it kind of reifies these constructs that we're also trying to sort of mediate.
Exactly.
But yeah, on that same subject, there's been some question about, like, some controversy about the race question relating to Hispanic and Latino populations. It's kind of tiered in a different way. Nobody else gets sort of an ethnic and a racial identification. Can you tell us a bit about the history of that question?
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question. So as I said, the categories that the census used to classify people by race have changed over time. And in the 1930 census, there was a new category called Mexican. And the purpose of this category, so I should say that immigration from Mexico to the United States had increased considerably since about 1900. In 1924, the United States established really strict restrictions on immigration from other parts of the world. So people from Asia were barred entirely from immigrating to the United States. For people from Europe, there were quotas. So more people were allowed to immigrate from Northern and Western Europe, fewer people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And just another piece of census history is that the census was used to establish the quotas. So that the people who developed the quotas looked back to the census of I believe it was the census of 1890, to see, okay, how many people from each part of the world were in the United States at the time, and use that as the basis for these quotas. So we have very strict restrictions against people from Europe, absolutely no immigration from Asia. There really hadn't been much immigration from Africa at the time. The place that was left was Latin America and Canada, the Western Hemisphere. And there were no restrictions on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. So when sources of cheap labor from other parts of the world were kind of cut off as a result of these immigration restrictions, employers in the United States really turned to Latin America, and particularly Mexico, to recruit workers and promote immigration from Latin America and especially Mexico. So after 1900, but especially after 1924, immigration from Mexico increases. And that starts to make some people in Congress very anxious. And so they decide to add a Mexican category to the race variable to track this immigration. And so this is a problem for people who are classified as Mexican in 1930, because remember, this is before 1964. So if you're classified as anything other than white, you're subject to segregation. You're subject to substandard access to basically all of the rights of citizenship, whether you're a citizen, if you are a citizen, you're still subject to substandard rights. And people from Mexico started to worry that if this category is being tracked, that data might in the future be used to restrict immigration. And so Latin American civil rights groups, together with actually the Mexican government, petitioned the United States government to reclassify people from Mexico as white. So in the 1940 census, the Mexican category was gone, and census enumerators were specifically instructed that anyone from Mexico or of Mexican ancestry is to be classified as white. Now, fast forward to the post-1964 era, the federal government wanted a way to protect the civil rights of Mexicans and other people from Latin America. And given the kind of fraught history of race in the Western Hemisphere, when the Statistical Directive number 15 that I just talked about, when that was established, what they did was they established, at that time it was 4 race categories. I mentioned 5 earlier, but initially Asians and Pacific Islanders were grouped together into one category, so 4 race categories. And then the Congress, also the Office of Management and Budget, also established this new thing called ethnicity. And so they said, okay, there's 4 races that will be protected and 2 ethnicities. And the ethnicities are Hispanic and not Hispanic. So basically, ever since 1977, the United States has classified people along 2 axes. So one is race. So you could be white, black, Native American or Alaska Native, or Asian or Pacific Islander. And then the other axis was ethnicity, so you could be either Hispanic or not Hispanic. And as a result of that, I don't want to say as a result, but following the establishment of OMB 15, the census has always asked 2 questions. So beginning in the 1980 census, the census asks 2 questions. So one question, are you Hispanic or not? And then if you say that you are Hispanic, you can also add your nationality. And then the other question is, what is your race? And the options that are given for race are the ones that I just mentioned. And then there's also an other category. And according to the kind of government's schema, nobody should be falling in that other category. But because many Latinx people, especially now, don't identify as white, which is how the government would have them identify, it becomes difficult for Latinx people to identify with these race categories, and as a result, many people do check the other box. And I corrected myself earlier when I first said that the separation of race and ethnicity in the census was a result of OMB 15, and then I corrected myself because OMB 15 does not actually require that the census ask these 2 questions separately. All it requires is that the data can be distinguished among these categories. And so it certainly is possible for the Census Bureau to combine the race and ethnicity question and just to include Hispanic or Latinx as a category along with white, black, and all the others. And it can give people boxes to write in their nationality if it wants to. It can do that without violating OMB 15. And this has actually been a matter of debate within the government since the last, actually much longer than since the last census, but recommendations to combine the race and ethnicity questions have, people who have been recommending those have shown through like surveys and pretests that this actually would reduce the number of people checking the other box, because if Latinx people can identify with the race categories, they are less likely to choose the other box. And it was decided for the 2020 census to keep asking the question the same way it had been asked in 2010. And given the data that now exists on this question, it's very likely that that was done intentionally to, kind of maintain the status quo, which I think does also result in undercounting of Latinx people.
Yeah. How does the government count other?
Right. I don't know for sure.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, what's the usefulness of having,
Well, there's very little utility to having this other category, but I think
I guess you have an emerging. I guess if you have an emerging ethnic racial group that you weren't aware of.
Yeah, and I should say that Latinx people are not the only ones who kind of are in this pickle a little bit. So Middle Eastern people from Middle Eastern countries and who have Middle Eastern ancestry, Middle East and North Africa, are classified as white in the census. And again, this is because there was a long history of people from the Middle East and North Africa petitioning to be classified as white for purposes of citizenship and rights in the United States. There were a series of Supreme Court cases, or I should say federal court cases, because not all of them made it to the Supreme Court. But federal court cases around 100 years ago, where people from different parts of the country had to petition to be allowed to naturalize in the United States, because up until quite recently, I want to say the 50s, naturalization, you could only naturalize if you were white or of African ancestry. But this,
interesting.
Yeah. So, but white was never defined. So people from different parts of the world would petition to naturalize, and if they were allowed to naturalize, people from that part of the world were then considered white. If they were not allowed to naturalize, people from that part of the world were then not considered white. And so several cases where people from the Middle East were allowed to naturalize. And so kind of in conjunction with that, the census never created a category of Middle East and North Africa. But particularly in this century, in the 21st century, people of Middle Eastern descent are experiencing discrimination. It would be very nice for the federal government to be able to defend their civil rights, and the federal government needs data for that. And so there have been movements to add Middle East and North Africa as a category in the race question. Again, this would not violate OMB 15, but at least for the 2020 census, that's not going to happen.
So, even though the citizenship question has been blocked by courts, from what I understand, with the current administration taking a hard stance on immigration, can we expect that Hispanics and Latinx will be undercounted next year? And what are the impacts of this?
Yeah, I don't know what to expect in terms of undercounting. So if the citizenship question had gone through, then I would say yes, definitely. We can definitely expect undercounting. I hope that because the question was blocked, that we won't have as much undercounting as we would have had otherwise. But yeah, it's definitely the whole debate around the citizenship question has definitely had a chilling effect. and I think will make many people, particularly Latinx people, but not only Latinx people, I think will make many people wary of participating in the census. And this is really unfortunate, because being counted in the census is so important, for, as I said, for civil rights purposes, for apportionment purposes. Even federal funding is allocated to localities on the basis of census counts. So these are all the issues of undercounting. And I should say, that regardless, even without the whole debate about the citizenship question, there is always undercounting in the census, and undercounting is not random. So people who are more likely to be undercounted are certainly people who are poorer and who are non-white, but also anyone who does not have a standard address because the census is done through the mail, or who moves frequently or has moved recently is at risk of being undercounted because of the way that the census is done through the mail. So the people we typically see being undercounted in terms of that are young men in particular, young women as well, and so like people in their 20s, and then any of their kids would also be undercounted. And this is particularly the case for non-white people and poorer people. And so what's the problem with undercounting? So the problem with undercounting is, as I said, that representation in the federal government is allocated on the basis of these census counts. So what it means when people are undercounted is that the congressional representatives for those people have a stronger burden. They're representing more people than they might be otherwise if people were counted accurately, which means that the people living in those localities also have less of a say in the federal government than people in localities that are being more accurately counted. There's also issues of federal funding, as I said, because funding is allocated on the basis of census counts. So places with high levels of undercount and cities have much higher undercounts than rural areas for these same reasons that I've talked about. And as a result of that, everyone living in these areas gets kind of shortchanged of their representation in the government.
Yeah, it is important to participate. I know that culturally, I'm African American, and I know that in a lot of my neighborhoods, and it's gotten better as the generations have gotten, are coming up and are further. Time has passed since civil rights, but I know a lot of people who get very nervous about giving. Maybe it's a kind of paranoia, but it's actually kind of based in some rational fears of like telling the government where you are and what you have and what you're doing. And for a lot of people, that's kind of chilling. They hear that knock and they see the census person, and they run to the basement and hope they go away. But I'm really glad we're getting this information out there so that people can realize that there's a lot of positive benefits to being counted, and it's a really important thing to make sure that you are represented, and so you don't have to feel like that as much anymore. If we don't show up, we can't really make that change.
Yeah, and I should say, as you said, these kind of fears of the government knowing who you are and where you are completely founded, and at the same time, it's by being counted that we can have more of a say in the government and make sure that the government is using the information it collects for positive purposes rather than negative purposes. And so I should say that the Census Bureau collects your information. The Census Bureau is legally restricted from sharing that information with any other branches of government. So no information can be used, to prosecute you, to deport you. Information from the Census Bureau stays within the census, and the government takes your privacy in the census actually very seriously.
Yeah, they've actually come up this year with some new technology that's going to introduce certain types of noise and other things to sort of maintain the security of information. And there are some concerns because it's sort of the first time that they're using these new technologies to protect privacy. So it's going to up the cost of the census as well. But it is really interesting, and yeah, it is private, and they are making great leaps and investing a lot in keeping it private.
Yeah, and at the same time, as citizens, we have to keep an eye on the government in order to make sure that the government keeps those promises, because that can change at any point with,
Absolutely, absolutely.
executive orders or, I hope not. But we do need to keep an eye on the government to make sure that they're using our data responsibly. And when we participate in the census, we are staking a claim on the government to be able to, keep an eye on what it's doing with our data.
How are the incarcerated counted? Are their personal details reported by the system, or do they self-report?
Yeah, so the census is done on the basis of dwelling units. So each dwelling unit, each house or apartment receives a census form in the mail. So a prison would count as like kind of a single dwelling unit. These are at least used to be called group quarters. I don't know if they still are. And so the information about each person living in the census would be filled out by the administration. So it's reported by the prison system, and probably according to whatever official data are available there.
Can representation numbers be skewed by there being a large number of incarcerated people who were displaced from their home region? If they were they might have been arrested one place or been living one place and then end up in in detention somewhere else. And so are they then counted in the place, the dwelling?
Yeah. So this is actually a really serious civil rights problem, and it's a really important question. So I'm glad you asked. But yeah, so in the census, people who are incarcerated are counted as residents of the place where they are incarcerated. But as we know, in most states, people who are incarcerated can't vote. And so what happens is that the localities where the prisons are, and these are often rural areas with not that many people anyway, those populations get inflated. And the places where people who are incarcerated came from, the places either where they lived before they were arrested or where their families live, then get deflated. And so this trickles up into representation, certainly at the level of state government, but also in the federal government as well, in the House of Representatives. And so as a result of that, basically the people who are living near prisons, not in prisons, but near prisons, their vote counts more. And the people, the families of incarcerated people, their vote counts less as a result. And I should say also that some states do allow incarcerated people to vote, but they require them to vote by absentee ballot from their previous residence. And so again, their vote is basically being diluted for certain things, their vote is being diluted because they are being counted somewhere else. And let's see. Oh, and so most people who are incarcerated are incarcerated in the state where they previously lived, because most people are in state prisons rather than federal prisons. So this doesn't have a huge effect on actually like increasing the representation of some states as opposed to other states. But it does have that effect within states at the level of state government. And then federal prisoners also could be in a different state than the state where they live. And there's actually some really good information about incarceration and the census at a website. Am I allowed to?
Absolutely,
Okay.
Please share.
So the URL is prisonersofthecensus.org.
Prisonersofthecensus.org. Look it up. I was reading an NPR article where Hansi Lo Wang reported that the census is asking states to provide driver's license records to produce census data. And I'm wondering if this might become even more of a trend as it's getting really expensive to get data, and it becomes even more expensive with non-responses. Do you think the census will move more towards indirect and more involuntary methods by which to get their data?
Yeah, so that article, so what's actually being done now is the Census Bureau is requesting driver's license records in order to produce data about citizenship. So this is kind of the alternative.
So it's sort of a backdoor to the citizenship question, as opposed to, oh, we need census data because we have low reporting.
Exactly. So this is a backdoor to the citizenship question. So states are being asked to provide driver's license records to the Census Bureau in order to generate data about citizenship. And what it said in the article is that the data will be aggregated. It won't be like a list of who is a citizen and who isn't. That they'll be aggregated. I'm not sure if it's to the state level or other levels. But what is possible is that those data could be used for drawing voting districts when redistricting happens in 2021. So that is something to watch out for. And yeah, but I think this is a really good question about is the census kind of moving toward this more involuntary model? And as of right now, so I'll go back 10 years. In 2010, and previous to that, what would happen if you didn't return your census form is that the Census Bureau would send someone to your house. They'd send someone or they might call you. If you didn't answer the phone, they might send someone to your house. They might send someone to your house a couple of times. And that gets expensive. And so what they're planning to do in the 2020 census, in order to keep costs down, if you don't send in your form, they're going to try to get that information elsewhere, from administrative records, from whatever government agencies you might have been in contact with, certainly the DMV, to get that information about you. And there will be, I think there already have been recommendations to move the census to this format where the data is just kind of being collected from other administrative records. The IRS certainly has information about a lot of people that could be used for this purpose. And certainly as a cost-saving measure. And I have heard people in various, not in the government, but social scientists in various places making these recommendations, either that the government kind of attach the census to the tax process or get information from administrative data. And the problem, I think these are things we should be very skeptical about. I think these are recommendations that we should treat with a lot of skepticism. And the reason for that is because right now the census is not attached to anything else. The census is a freestanding way of being counted in order to make your voice heard in the political process. It's to be counted specifically for the purpose of political apportionment. If it gets connected to something else, then you have more incentives and disincentives to participate in the census. So, for example, if the census is attached to tax, people who are evading taxes for some reason might also not be counted in the census. But also, if we start getting the census from other administrative agencies, people, the amount of information that exists in those agencies is also really uneven. Some people, there's more information about some people, less information about other people, especially if it's things that kind of require privilege. Like a lot of people don't have driver's license. Where is the government going to get information about them? Also, if the government starts turning to private companies, so like consumer data, to get this information, some people don't have consumer data records because they're not consuming that much. And that could create new and I think more serious problems of undercounting than we already have. So I think that this is something to keep a close eye on.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you think we should be aware of coming up with the 2020 census that we haven't talked about?
This was a really thorough set of questions. Yeah, I can't think of anything else.
Well, thank you so much. I learned so much, and I also got some new ways and perspectives, about how to think about the census, which I always do when I talk to you about what's going on in history and what's going on right now, and how those two things interrelate. So this has been Abolition Radio, and this was Dawn Warfield talking with Professor Emily Merchant of the Science and Technology Studies Department, and I hope you have a great day and be counted.